I had never been one for remote getaways. I liked my modern comforts, the easy access to phone signal, and the sense of control that comes with being surrounded by technology and civilization. But when my old friend Jim suggested a weekend in a remote cabin in the hills of northern New Mexico, I figured it was time to step outside of my comfort zone. He had rented a cabin far off the beaten path, far enough that I couldn't get any signal on my phone unless I walked several miles uphill. This, I thought, was just the kind of break I needed. Jim and I had grown up together, but we'd both become more caught up in the grind of adulthood. This trip, he said, would be a chance to reconnect, unwind, and escape from the chaos. The drive there was long, winding, and isolated. The flat, sprawling desert landscape slowly gave way to jagged hills covered in a mix of sagebrush and pine trees. The sun was beginning to dip behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows on the narrow road ahead. My truck bounced on the uneven gravel road, the tires kicking up a fine layer of dust. As the miles passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading deeper into nowhere. Jim had promised the cabin was cozy, equipped with all the essentials, but as the sky darkened, I found myself wondering if this was a mistake. Finally, the cabin came into view, old, weathered wood with a stone chimney poking out from the roof. It looked like something out of an old Western movie, nestled against a backdrop of pine trees. Jim had assured me it was sturdy, but I couldn't help but notice the way the place seemed to sag under the weight of years. A sense of abandonment lingered around it, despite the fact that it was meant to be our home for the weekend. Jim parked the truck, and we both unloaded our gear. He was already unloading the cooler and bags with a grin on his face. "Man, this is going to be great," he said, his voice carrying the excitement of someone eager to escape the rush of daily life. I gave the cabin one last look, feeling a twinge of unease, before following him inside. The interior was surprisingly cozy, with a stone fireplace, a rustic wooden dining table, and a couch that looked like it had seen better days. A single oil lamp sat on a small wooden table, casting a soft glow across the room. The smell of pine and old wood filled the air. "Don't worry about the place," Jim said, dropping his bag onto the couch. "It's got everything we need. Plus, we're completely off-grid here. No distractions." I nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin, though functional, seemed like it hadn't been used much. Dust settled in the corners, and a couple of the windows had a faint mistiness to them, like they hadn't been cleaned in a long time. The floorboards creaked as we moved through the rooms, each step causing the silence to feel heavier. After a quick tour of the place, we set up our gear and went outside to start a fire. The cool mountain air hit me as soon as I stepped out onto the porch. The sun had fully set now, and the only light came from the dying embers of the campfire Jim had started. We spent the evening sitting around it, sharing stories and cracking open beers. The fire crackled and popped, its light casting long, dancing shadows against the trees. By the time we decided to call it a night, the moon was high in the sky, and the forest surrounding the cabin had become an impenetrable dark void. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees. I found myself staring at the dark woods, an irrational sense of unease creeping over me. The sound of the wind through the branches sounded almost too deliberate, too purposeful. I shook it off. It was just the isolation, the unfamiliar surroundings. I turned to Jim, who was already heading back into the cabin. "You coming?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Yeah, just a second," I replied, though the thought of heading back into the cabin wasn't as comforting as it should have been. The night passed without incident, but I didn't sleep well. I woke several times to the sound of the wind against the cabin, but there was something else too, something faint. At first, I thought it was just the trees groaning under the wind, but it sounded like footsteps. Heavy, slow steps moving just outside the cabin. The kind of sound that makes your heart skip a beat. I lay there for a long time, straining to hear, but the noise stopped before I could make sense of it. The next morning, the air was still thick with tension, though Jim didn't seem to notice. He was in high spirits, already getting breakfast going, humming along with the radio that had been left on in the corner of the room. "I think we should go for a hike today," Jim suggested between bites of his cereal. "There's an old trail nearby. Should be a nice change of pace." I nodded, trying to push the odd feeling aside. I wasn't about to let my nerves ruin the trip. We ate breakfast quickly and then set out on the hike. The trail was steep, winding its way up the side of a small mountain. As we walked, the forest opened up to reveal breathtaking views of the valley below. The air was thin, and my chest burned with each breath, but the scenery was beautiful. After a few hours, we reached the summit. We sat on a rocky outcrop, taking in the view and snapping pictures. It was quiet, eerily so. The usual buzz of wildlife was absent. Even the wind seemed to have died down. We stayed for a while, soaking in the quiet, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt like the world was holding its breath. As we headed back down, the unease continued to gnaw at me. The wind picked up again, and the trees seemed to whisper, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. It was a strange sensation, like we were being watched. I caught a glimpse of something, a flicker of movement in the trees, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. That night, the feeling of being watched only intensified. Jim, ever the optimist, suggested we light another fire outside, but as the fire crackled, I couldn't shake the impression that something was out there, lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. I could hear movement in the trees now, the unmistakable rustling of something brushing against the foliage. "Probably just some animals," Jim said, his voice reassuring but distant. He didn't seem concerned, but my unease grew with every passing minute. As the fire burned down to embers, the darkness around the cabin seemed to grow thicker. The forest was alive with sound now, an unsettling rustling, a low growl, and the occasional snap of a twig. I stood up, suddenly on edge. There was something in the woods, something big. I told Jim I was going inside, that I didn't feel right about staying out there. He shrugged it off, finishing his drink before following me into the cabin. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise from outside sent me straight to the window, peering into the dark. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there. Bears, mountain lions, even people. The wind howled again, but this time, I could swear I heard a voice, low and muffled, coming from just beyond the trees. The next morning, I suggested we pack up and leave. Jim was disappointed but agreed. It wasn't until we were loading the truck that I saw it. The unmistakable imprint of large, heavy boots, leading from the tree line and stopping just at the edge of the porch. We left that day. We didn't talk much on the way home, but neither of us said anything about the footprints. I still think about that cabin, the quiet, the eerie feeling of being watched, and those footsteps outside. To this day, I'm not sure what I felt out there, but I know one thing. Not all places are meant to be explored, and sometimes the best way to survive is to simply walk away. It was late October 2016. I had just turned 32. My name is Daniel Ward, and that year had been a mess from start to finish. I'd gone through a breakup in March, lost my job in June, and my dad had passed away in August from complications after a heart surgery. I was burnt out and needed to step away from everything familiar. Too many memories, too many calls to return, and too many looks from friends who meant well but didn't understand how heavy it had all gotten. That's when I decided to go away for a week, somewhere far, not a resort or hotel. I didn't want people, conversations, or noise, just silence and space. I booked a small off-grid cabin in the countryside of Wales, outside a tiny village called Abercombe. It was tucked away in a valley, surrounded by thick woods, rolling hills, and endless fences that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I found it online through an old listing that looked like it had been made in 2009 Barebones website Grainy Photos. The kind of place you don't tell many people about. I packed up my old Honda with the basics. Canned food, water jugs, firewood, a few books, a journal, and clothes. I brought my dad's old hunting knife with me too, more out of habit than anything else. I'd been to quiet places before, but never one this isolated. No phone signal, no neighbors, no electricity besides what came from a small solar panel for lights and a USB charging port. There was no Wi-Fi. That was a plus for me. The drive from Bristol took about 5 hours, and the last hour was on single-track roads barely wide enough for one car. My tires crunched over wet gravel and mud, and my GPS gave up about 20 minutes from the cabin. I found it by following printed instructions the owner had emailed me a week earlier. Turn at the crooked stone wall, follow the dirt path until the fence with the red cloth tied to it, and so on. Eventually, I pulled into a clearing where a short wooden cabin stood alone under a sky that looked like it was ready to pour. It had a slanted roof, moss growing on the edges, and a single porch light that flickered to life as I stepped onto the decking. Inside, the cabin was small, just one room with a wood-burning stove, a single bed, a small table with 2 chairs, a gas burner, and a shelf stacked with mismatched dishes. The bathroom was an outhouse about 15 steps into the woods, built from planks and plastic sheets. It had a compost toilet and a bucket for washing, which you filled from a rain barrel outside. By the time I settled in and unpacked, it was dusk. I made myself a quick meal of beans and bread, heated water over the stove for tea, and sat in the silence. I hadn't realized how much I missed silence. No traffic, no buzzing, no emails, no televisions murmuring behind apartment walls. Just the wind against the trees and the occasional crack of branches. The first night passed without anything strange. I read by a dim LED lantern, then crawled into bed and listened to the wind howl. The walls creaked a little, probably from the chill, and I thought I heard something scurry under the floorboards once, but that didn't bother me. It was an old building. Mice weren't a surprise. The next morning, I woke up early, around 6:30. Mist clung to the ground outside like a low fog, and everything looked faded, like a faded photograph. I boiled water for instant coffee, dressed in layers, and went for a walk up the hill behind the cabin. The grass was damp and slick, and my boots sunk in places where the mud hadn't firmed up. I followed a trail that looked barely used, broken fence posts, hoof prints in dried mud, and old metal gates tied shut with rope. I walked for about 2 hours, letting my head clear. The air smelled like wet leaves and old wood. Eventually, I circled back, cut through a different patch of woods, and came out on the opposite side of the cabin from where I started. That's when I noticed something that didn't sit right. There were tire tracks, deep ones, cut into the grass and mud near the cabin. They hadn't been there the day before. I knew that for a fact because I'd parked a bit off the trail, and the ground had looked untouched when I arrived. These tracks were fresh. You could still see where water had pooled in the grooves. I looked around, trying to figure out if maybe someone from the village had come by, maybe a farmer or landowner checking on the place. But there was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no noise. I stood still for a while, listening. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Even birds weren't chirping. It felt like something was off, but I couldn't figure out what. Back inside the cabin, I sat by the stove and tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just someone turning around. Maybe a hunter or someone checking fence lines. But the tracks went straight toward the back of the cabin. They stopped a few feet from the window. That window faced the bed. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept my knife close and moved the bed away from the window. I didn't want to be in view if someone came back. Around midnight, I thought I heard something out there, like footsteps, slow and soft, moving through the leaves. But when I peeked through the curtain, I saw nothing. No flashlight beams, no movement. The next morning, I checked outside again. No new tracks, but something had changed. The firewood stack that I kept just under the porch was slightly disturbed. It looked like a few pieces had been moved, not knocked over, just shifted. Like someone had gone through it and then put it back quickly. That day, I didn't go far. I stayed within view of the cabin, keeping an ear out, watching the trees. I kept the door locked, and I started keeping the knife on me even inside. I noticed small things more now, like the broken twig by the outhouse, or the faint smell of smoke on the breeze that wasn't from my own fire. I hadn't seen another soul in 3 days. By the fourth night, things got worse. I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. It wasn't a dream or a noise that woke me. It was a feeling, the kind that grabs you in the stomach and doesn't let go. I sat up in the dark and listened. The stove had gone out, so the cabin was cold. I heard something outside, not walking exactly, more like shifting, like someone standing still and adjusting their weight. Leaves crunching under slow, deliberate steps. I didn't move. I just sat there, barely breathing. Then I heard it again, closer. My heart was beating in my ears. I leaned toward the window slowly, but before I could pull the curtain, something scraped against the wall. Not violently, just a soft scrape, like fingernails or maybe a knife edge dragged slowly across the wood. I didn't check. I stayed in the dark until it passed. When daylight finally came, I found more tracks. This time, they led from the woods to the back of the cabin and stopped at the wall beneath the window again. But this time, there was something else. Muddy handprints, smeared across the lower panel of the wall, human-sized. One looked like it had slipped, as if the person had leaned in close or tried to climb up. That was the first time I considered leaving. I packed some things in case I had to go quickly, but I waited. I didn't want to drive in a panic, not on those muddy back roads. I had a few more days left in my rental, and part of me wanted to know who was messing with me and why. That evening, I stayed outside until just after sunset, hiding behind a tree about 30 feet from the cabin. I wanted to see if anyone came back. The cold soaked into my bones as I waited. I had my flashlight off, my knife in my hand. Hours passed. Then, just after midnight, I saw movement near the tree-line. A figure, tall, wearing a hood or maybe a cap. They stayed low, moving slowly toward the cabin. Not walking confidently like someone who owned the place, more like someone sneaking in. They stopped at the same side wall. I could barely see them in the dark, but I could tell they were looking in through the window, watching the bed, watching what they thought was me. That was it. I stood up and made noise, snapped branches, shouted, anything to let them know I was out there and not inside. The figure turned and bolted, fast. I chased for a few seconds, but they disappeared into the woods. I didn't follow far. I didn't know the terrain well, and I didn't want to get hurt. When I got back, I grabbed my bag, threw everything in the car, and left. I didn't care if it was 2 a.m. I drove back to the main road, my hands shaking the whole time. I drove until I hit a motorway and pulled into a service station. I parked under the lights and locked the doors. Slept a little in the car, engine off, knife in hand. I didn't tell anyone at first. What was I going to say? Someone watched me sleep for days? That they left no trace except tracks and mud? But a few weeks later, I looked up reports from that area. Turns out a man had gone missing the year before. Local, mid-40s. Had a breakdown, they said. His car was found abandoned near that same stretch of road I'd taken to the cabin. People assumed he'd wandered into the woods and died, but no body was ever found. I don't know if it was him. I don't know if it was someone else entirely. Maybe a drifter, maybe a squatter. But I haven't been back to the countryside since. That week changed something in me. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the reminder that sometimes people are out there, just watching, waiting, not for any reason that makes sense. Not always to rob or kill. Sometimes they just watch, and you'll never know how close they were until it's too late. I've moved cities since then. I keep curtains closed at night. I don't vacation alone anymore. And sometimes, when I wake up at 2 a.m., I still think about the sound of someone shifting their weight outside my wall. It's a chilly evening in late October when I found myself up at a remote cabin in the woods. I had driven up to this place in northern Michigan, looking for a weekend of solitude, a break from the noise of the city, the kind of peace that only the woods can offer. A friend of mine, a retired cop, had mentioned this place several times in passing. His name was Ray. He'd spoken about how isolated it was, how no one ever came up this way, how the only thing you'd hear in the night was the wind moving through the pines. Ray had passed away earlier this year. He'd been old, even by retired cop standards, but still sharp and stubborn, living alone in the same house for decades. He'd been one of those guys who didn't talk much about his career, never mentioned the things he'd seen, but I knew he had stories that might have been too dark for the light of day. He'd been working a desk job by the time I met him, just a few years before he retired. We had hit it off despite the age difference, and over time, he became a mentor of sorts to me, guiding me through life lessons, little things that stuck with me. After his death, I figured I'd honor his memory by taking the trip to the cabin, a quiet place to reflect, away from everything. The drive up had been uneventful. The weather was calm, and I had an old playlist on repeat, something to fill the silence. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting a golden light over the trees. The driveway was gravel, leading up to a modest two-story cabin nestled between towering pines. A wooden porch wrapped around one side of the house, and the front door creaked when I pushed it open, the smell of wood and dust filling the air. It was exactly as Ray had described it. Quiet, remote, and a little neglected, but comfortable enough. I spent the first evening unpacking, setting up my things, and making a fire in the wood stove. It was a small fire, just enough to warm the cabin. I thought about Ray then, about how much he must have loved this place. I sat in the dim light, sipping coffee, letting the crackling fire soothe my mind, trying to put everything that had happened with Ray's passing behind me for a few days. But his absence still gnawed at me. Later that night, when the fire was burning low and the chill crept into the cabin's corners, I decided to turn in. I was alone in the cabin, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight of being completely isolated. No buzzing of phones, no chatter, just the stillness of the woods outside. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches of the trees, but I found it peaceful, like the forest was wrapping its arms around the cabin, keeping it safe. I woke up to the sound of something outside, footsteps, faint at first, but they became louder, clearer. My body stiffened, and I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It was the middle of the night, and the last thing I expected was company. Ray had always said that the nearest neighbor was miles away, and even then, they didn't come this far into the woods. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and slipped out of bed, my heart pounding a little faster than usual. The moonlight barely filtered through the trees, leaving most of the yard in shadow, but I could make out the faint outline of something moving near the edge of the clearing. I was about to step outside when I heard a loud bang from the direction of the front door. It sounded like something or someone had slammed against it. I froze. No animal made that noise. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure of what to do. I had a sense of dread creeping up my spine, something in my gut telling me I was not alone. I knew better than to confront whoever or whatever was out there in the dark, especially in this kind of setting. My hand shook as I tightened my grip on the flashlight, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I slipped on my boots and quietly approached the door, carefully pulling it open just a crack. There, standing in the dim light near the edge of the porch, was a figure. I could barely make out the shape, but I could tell it was a man. He was wearing a dark jacket, and his head was slightly bowed, as though he was waiting for something or someone. I almost called out, but something in me stopped me. This wasn't right. I wasn't expecting anyone, and no one from around here would come out this far, not in the dead of night. The man stood still for a few more moments, then turned and started to walk away, heading toward the woods. It was then that I heard the unmistakable sound of boots crunching on the gravel. The man was walking in the direction of the old trail that led deeper into the forest. I knew that path. Ray had taken me down it once, years ago, showing me the landmarks, talking about his patrols back when he was still on duty. But that was a lifetime ago, and it felt as though something was wrong now. I stood there for a long moment, debating with myself. Should I go after him? Was he just a wanderer? No, something didn't feel right. I wasn't about to follow a strange man in the dark, not knowing who he was or why he was here. Slowly, I closed the door, locking it behind me, and tried to settle back into bed. But I couldn't sleep. I kept listening for sounds, for any movement, my mind racing. After what felt like hours, I heard it again. This time it was different. The same footsteps, but now they were closer, more deliberate. The floorboards creaked under the weight, the sound of something heavy moving across the porch. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was outside again. I grabbed the flashlight, moved toward the window, and peered out into the dark. Nothing. The woods were still eerily so, but my instincts screamed at me that I wasn't alone. That feeling of dread crept up my neck again, making the hairs on the back of my arms stand up. I considered calling the police, but then it hit me. Ray had always said that if you're out here, you're on your own. The nearest town was over an hour away. The only help would come after it was too late. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the blackness, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But then, through the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move along the edge of the cabin. It was slow, methodical. I was sure it wasn't an animal. I had a choice now. Stay hidden and hope whoever it was would leave, or make a move and confront whatever was out there. But as I stood there, waiting for some sign, I felt it. A sudden, cold wave of realization. The man from earlier had circled back. My heart raced as I grabbed the small handgun Ray had kept under the floorboards, a weapon he'd kept with him in case of emergencies. It wasn't much, but it was something. I had never thought I'd need to use it, but now I wasn't sure. Should I confront him, or should I wait for him to make the first move? Then I heard it, a sudden sharp crack, the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. He was inside. I didn't hesitate. I rushed to the kitchen, trying to move as quietly as possible. My hands were shaking, but I tried to steady myself. I peeked through the crack in the door leading to the living room. The man was standing near the broken window, his back to me, scanning the room. I was about to move when I heard something that made my stomach turn. A low, gruff voice. He was talking to someone. "Thought I'd find you here," the man said, his voice filled with malice. "You're not as smart as you think." I froze. There was no way I could take him on. He was a cop, a real cop, not some stranger with bad intentions. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just some random trespasser. This man knew what he was doing. I had no choice. I made my way to the back door, trying to stay out of sight, my heart thudding in my chest. But before I could even step outside, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, rapid and urgent. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the weight of the cop's hand on my shoulder, spinning me around. His face was twisted with something I couldn't understand. Rage, fear, maybe both. And then nothing. The next morning, I woke up in the same spot where I had fallen, my head pounding. The room was still, and I could hear birds chirping outside. The man was gone. The cabin was eerily silent. The glass from the window was still scattered across the floor. Took me a while to piece things together, but when I did, it all made sense. Ray's death had been no accident. It had been planned. The cop, his old partner, had been involved. It wasn't just about me being here. It was about him making sure no one knew the truth about what happened all those years ago. I made it out of the cabin that morning, breathing the fresh air for the first time in what felt like forever. I left the woods behind me, knowing I would never come back. The truth about Ray's death would stay buried in these woods, and as for the man who had come to finish what he started, he'd never be caught. But at least I was alive, and for the first time in a long while, I understood the silence of the forest. It wasn't peaceful, it was deadly. I was 31 the year I decided to take a break from everything. My name's Lucas Hayes, and at that time I had just quit my job in Portland, Oregon. I'd worked a construction management job for 7 years straight with hardly any time off that didn't involve sick days or family emergencies. The job paid well, but it drained the life out of me. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, and honestly, I just needed to be away from people, away from buildings, away from the city noise. I wanted a reset. So I packed up my old Toyota 4Runner and headed east toward the forested edge of Idaho. I didn't have a real plan, just a few paper maps, a stack of canned food, water jugs, a couple tarps, my camping gear, and a vague idea that I'd find a spot to pitch a tent, maybe do some hiking, some thinking. I told my brother where I was headed generally, left my phone off most of the time, and got out of the city. It was early October, and the air was already getting colder once I passed the Cascade foothills. 3 days in, I was somewhere north of McCall, Idaho, driving through stretches of narrow dirt roads deep into the forest. It was remote, just miles and miles of pine, gravel crunching under the tires, the sun cutting through branches overhead. I hadn't seen another car in hours. At some point, I passed what looked like a barely visible trail leading off the road. I didn't think much of it, but something about the area felt right. Felt removed, quiet in a good way. I drove another half-mile before the road opened up a little, and I saw an old overgrown driveway buried in pine needles and brush, barely visible between two boulders. I stopped the car. Something made me back up and take a better look. The driveway wasn't paved, just packed dirt and moss, curved slightly into the trees, and I couldn't see where it led. Curiosity pushed me forward. I drove slow, tires slipping slightly in the soft ground. After about 2 minutes, the trees opened into a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. The cabin. It was maybe 20 yards ahead, partially hidden behind thick brush and a line of pine. It looked abandoned, wooden siding faded gray, the roof sagging a little in the middle. The windows were dirty and fogged, one of them cracked. It wasn't large, just a single-story square-shaped place with a small porch that was half rotted out and an old metal chimney sticking up the side. I got out of the 4Runner and stood still for a minute. It was dead silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring a little.
No birdsong.
No wind, nothing. I walked around the cabin slowly, boots crunching in frost-tipped grass. There were no tracks, no signs anyone had been there for years. The door was shut, and a rusted padlock hung from the latch, but it had been busted off long ago. One of the windows in the back was boarded halfway with old planks, but I could see inside a little. Looked empty. I stood there for a while thinking, this could work. I'd brought my tent, but this cabin would be better shelter if I could clear it out. It was far enough off the road, completely out of sight. No sign of trespassing, no graffiti, no trash around, nothing. By late afternoon, I made up my mind. I unstrapped my gear and started setting up outside the cabin. I figured I'd sleep in the tent that night and check out the inside the next morning in better light. The first night was calm. Cold, but calm. I lit a small fire in the pit I made about 20 feet from the cabin, cooked some beans, and just sat. I didn't see a single light or hear any sign of people. Only thing I heard was a couple of distant coyote calls around midnight, but nothing close. I slept okay. In the morning, I pried open the cabin door using my multi-tool. The inside was dusty, musty, but surprisingly intact. A small table sat in the center of the room with 2 chairs knocked over. There was an old cot in one corner, springs exposed and rusted. A cast iron stove was built into the wall opposite the door. It looked usable. Someone had tried to paint the walls yellow once, but it had all peeled off in big flaky patches. Mice droppings were scattered near the corners. One of the back corners smelled like mold. I spent most of that day cleaning, swept out a couple dead birds, cleared the mouse droppings, got rid of the moldy corner by pulling the old boards off and leaving the back window open to let it air. By sunset, it actually looked halfway decent. Not livable long-term, but better than the tent. I slept inside the cabin that night on my sleeping pad. It was a little unnerving at first. Every little creak made me sit up, but it was probably just the old boards contracting in the cold. By the third night, I felt more relaxed. I started hiking small trails around the area, took a few notes on a paper map. There was a small creek about a mile away I used to fill my jugs and filter drinking water. I cooked meals over the fire and journaled in the evenings. I stayed close to the cabin. That was the routine for the next week. Peaceful, simple, quiet. Until one morning I noticed something strange. I had a habit of stacking small pieces of chopped wood next to the front steps of the cabin. Split logs I'd cut with my hatchet for the fire. Every morning, I'd grab a few pieces and bring them to the pit. But on the 9th morning, the stack was different. It looked the same at first, but as I bent down, I noticed the top log had been turned perpendicular to the rest, like it had been rotated 90 degrees. I knew I didn't do that. I was neat about the stack, always kept them aligned. Could have been an animal, I thought, but what animal rotates a log and leaves it? I fixed the stack and didn't think too hard about it. Next morning, same thing. One of the logs rotated. Just one. Always on the top. No other sign of disturbance. That's when the unease started. I stayed alert the rest of the day. I checked the perimeter, walked a half-mile loop in all directions. No tracks, no broken branches, no wrappers, no sign of people. I didn't see a single boot print in the soft dirt around the cabin. I would have noticed. I started sleeping lighter. 2 nights later, something woke me. It was maybe 3 in the morning. I didn't have a clock, but I could feel how deep into the night it was. There wasn't a sound, but something made me open my eyes. I laid there, staring up at the cabin ceiling. My sleeping bag felt tight around my chest from how stiff I'd gone. I didn't hear anything.
No footsteps.
No movement, but I felt watched. It was the strangest thing. I couldn't explain it, and I'm not one to believe in vibes or energy or any of that. But something in me said don't move. My heart was pounding. I stayed frozen like that for maybe 15 minutes. Eventually, I turned my head slowly toward the window near the cot. It was too dark to see out, but I thought I saw a shadow move. It might have just been my reflection or trees shifting in the wind, but I remember holding my breath. I stared until my eyes watered. I got up and checked the door. Still shut, still latched. I sat up until dawn with my knife in hand. In the morning, I went outside. The firewood stack was gone. Not knocked over. Gone. There was nothing left. Not even bark. Not a single piece. All 12 logs I'd stacked the day before were missing. That's when I got scared. I checked everywhere. I walked the perimeter again, this time farther. I checked behind trees, up and down the old driveway, deep into the brush behind the cabin. Nothing. No signs of anything. I spent the rest of the day with my gear packed. I didn't leave yet. I wanted to believe it was a bear or something, but I kept my knife closer. I slept in the tent again that night, away from the cabin. It felt safer somehow. The cabin had started to feel watched. That night, I barely slept. Around 2 in the morning, I heard movement. Real, clear movement. It was footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. Crunching over frosted grass. Coming from the direction of the cabin. I held my breath and listened. They moved slowly, circling. Then they stopped, right outside the tent. I didn't breathe. My heart was thudding so hard I thought it might give me away. Whoever it was didn't say a word. They didn't knock, didn't try to get in. They just stood there. I waited. It must have been 20 minutes. The longest 20 minutes of my life. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, slowly fading into the direction of the trees. I stayed in that tent until the sun came up. When I finally unzipped it, I looked around and saw it. A single log, placed right in front of the tent door. Just one. From my original stack. That was it. I broke camp in 20 minutes. I didn't even try to clean up. I shoved everything in the back of the 4Runner, peeled out of that clearing, and drove down that overgrown driveway like a bat out of hell. I didn't stop until I hit a paved road an hour later. I kept driving until I reached a ranger station near Cascade. I didn't explain much, just said I'd gotten spooked by a bear. I spent the night in a cheap motel and left the state the next morning. It's been over a year since that happened. I don't go into the deep woods alone anymore. I still think about that cabin more than I should. I think about how someone knew I was there, watched me, waited until I felt safe before they made themselves known. I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. But I'll never go back to find out. Not ever. I had been to the old cabin countless times before. It had been my place of retreat for as long as I could remember. Nestled in the woods near the small town of Riverton, tucked between towering pines and moss-covered rocks, the cabin was my escape from the world. It wasn't fancy, just a small, worn-down structure with peeling paint and a rusting metal roof. Still, it had a certain charm, the kind that felt like home when everything else seemed too loud. I had inherited it from my grandfather a few years ago, after he passed away. He was a quiet man, a man of few words, but he had always talked about the cabin with a sense of reverence. "There's something about it," he'd say, his eyes distant, as if the place held some secret he couldn't quite explain. I was 32 when I decided to take some time off from work and spend a weekend there. It was late autumn, and the trees had started shedding their leaves. The air had a crisp bite to it, and the ground was littered with fallen branches, twigs, and the last remnants of summer's foliage. The silence of the forest was almost suffocating. It was the perfect escape. I'd been living in the city for years, and the constant hum of life there always made me feel restless. The cabin was the opposite, quiet, still, and almost suffocating in its solitude. There were no neighbors for miles. The nearest town, Riverton, was about a 20-minute drive away, but there wasn't much there. A couple of gas stations, a diner, and a handful of houses. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set. The trees were casting long shadows, and the sky was an orange-pink canvas. I pulled my truck up to the cabin, the gravel driveway crunching beneath the tires as I parked. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees was all I could hear. I had a lot of things to do. Cleaning up the cabin, making sure everything was in working order, and maybe cutting some firewood before the first snowstorm of the season hit. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. I never did. As I stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching against the gravel, I felt a strange sense of unease, but I chalked it up to the long drive. The chill in the air seemed sharper now, biting at my skin as I grabbed my gear from the truck and headed toward the front door. The old wooden steps creaked under my weight, and the door, which had never quite shut properly, groaned as I pushed it open. The interior was exactly how I remembered it: dusty, cluttered, and musty. The smell of old wood and dry earth filled the space. I set my bag down by the fireplace and immediately began unpacking. I had just started lighting the stove to warm the cabin when I noticed something strange. There was a faint smell in the air, one that didn't quite belong. It was a stale, metallic scent that made my stomach turn. I stopped what I was doing and looked around. At first, I thought it might just be the old pipes or something rotting in the walls, but the smell seemed stronger, closer. Curious, I walked over to the back of the cabin, toward the small bathroom and utility closet that my grandfather had always kept locked. The smell was definitely stronger here, pungent, almost sour. My heart rate started picking up, the unease I had felt earlier turning into something more palpable, like a cold weight pressing against my chest. The utility closet was small, crammed with cleaning supplies, old tools, and boxes my grandfather had stored away. I had no reason to think anything was wrong, but that smell, it was almost overpowering. I hesitated, then pushed the door open, my hand trembling just a little. The sight inside stopped me cold. Lying in the corner of the closet was a body. At first, I thought it was some sort of animal. Maybe a deer or a bear had somehow gotten inside and died. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was a man. He was sprawled out on the floor, his body twisted unnaturally. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his skin had taken on a pale, grayish hue. A fly buzzed lazily around the body, and I could see the dark stains on the floor where the blood had pooled. I felt my stomach churn, the bile rising in my throat. I didn't know what to do. For a moment, I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. The body looked like it had been there for a long time. I couldn't even remember the last time I had used the utility closet, but I was sure it had been months. How had I not noticed? How had I not smelled it? Panic set in as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. Someone had been here. Someone had died here, and somehow I hadn't known. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I stepped back, nearly tripping over a pile of old magazines, and slammed the door shut behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath came in short, shallow gasps. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not without knowing what happened. And I wasn't about to call the authorities. Not yet. Not without understanding the situation first. I paced the cabin, trying to clear my head. I needed to think. There had to be an explanation. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that I might never know the whole story. Whoever this man was, and whatever had happened to him, I was now a part of it. It was my cabin, my grandfather's cabin. It was supposed to be a place of peace, of solitude, but now it felt like a tomb. I decided to take a walk, just to clear my head. The cabin was built on the edge of a thick patch of forest, and I knew the woods well. The sound of the wind through the trees always had a calming effect on me, even when I was nervous. But today, nothing felt normal. The wind was howling through the trees, and the forest seemed colder, darker, as if it were alive with secrets. I needed to get out of there, just for a little while, to gather my thoughts. As I stepped outside, the forest greeted me with its familiar silence. But today, it felt different. The woods felt heavy, as if the trees themselves were watching me. I started walking, but after only a few minutes, I felt that strange feeling of being followed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was watching me. I kept walking, trying to dismiss the thought, but it wasn't long before I saw something in the distance. A flash of movement just past a cluster of trees. My stomach lurched. I froze, staring into the woods. Was it an animal? Another person? Couldn't tell. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed, but nothing came. I took a cautious step forward, then another, until I was standing at the edge of the small clearing. There was no sign of anyone or anything. I turned and hurried back to the cabin, my footsteps quick and uneven. I needed to get inside. I needed to feel safe again. But as I reached the front door, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door, which had been closed behind me when I left, was now wide open. I didn't hesitate. I ran inside and locked the door behind me. I didn't care who or what had been out there. I just knew I wasn't safe. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustling sound from the trees outside made my heart race. I couldn't stop thinking about the body in the closet. What had happened to him? Was he a victim of something? Or someone? And why had it taken me so long to find him? By morning, the panic had settled into a dull ache of fear. I had to leave. The longer I stayed, the more certain I became that I wasn't supposed to be there. Whoever this man was, whatever had happened, I didn't belong in that cabin anymore. I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to come back. Before I left, I made one last check of the cabin. I opened the closet door carefully, not knowing what I might find. The body was still there, unchanged, but something was different. The blood had dried, and the air smelled faintly of rot. The body was all but indistinguishable from the floor it lay on, so perfectly still, it almost looked like part of the cabin. I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed my things, locked the door, and drove away. The forest behind me receded, and I didn't look back. I didn't tell anyone what happened at that cabin. Couldn't. I knew the authorities would have their questions, and I wasn't ready to answer them. The woods were silent again, but for me, the mystery of what had happened would never leave. Some questions are better left unanswered. I was 32 that year, burned out from too many months working in front of a screen, managing data for a logistics company out of Reno. My name is Connor, and this happened in late September 2019. I'd taken a few weeks off after finishing a big project and wanted to get away from everything. I didn't want beaches or hotels. I didn't want Wi-Fi. I just wanted quiet and space. I thought going alone to a remote cabin in southern Colorado would be a perfect way to reset my mind. The place I found was far off the paved roads, a small, one-room cabin built back in the 1980s. It was nestled at the edge of a thick patch of pine and spruce in the San Juan Mountains, on a property owned by some guy who listed it on a private camping site. No electricity, no cell reception, just a propane stove, an old cot, and a rusty wood stove that rattled when you touched it. I had to hike the last mile to reach it because the dirt road leading up to it had washed out the previous spring. I liked that part. The hike made it feel more removed, like I was really leaving everything behind. I parked my Jeep near the edge of a dry creek bed, slung my pack on my back, and followed the narrow path that twisted through the woods and up into the hills. The trail hadn't been maintained in a while. Tree limbs hung low, and thorny bushes scratched my arms. There were deer prints in the dirt, and at one point I saw what looked like mountain lion tracks. I made a mental note to be cautious at night. It took me about an hour and a half to reach the cabin. It looked even more worn than it had in the pictures. The roof sagged in the middle, the wood siding was gray and cracked, and part of the front porch had caved in. But I wasn't looking for luxury. I liked that it was rough. It made it feel like mine. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. I spent my time hiking, sitting on the porch reading, writing in a notebook, drinking cheap whiskey from a metal cup, and just breathing in air that didn't smell like exhaust or recycled office heat. At night, I'd light a fire in the stove, boil some instant meals, and lie on the cot wrapped in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind sweep through the trees and the occasional crack of branches. I saw a few deer in the distance and once caught a glimpse of what I thought might have been a black bear across a small ridge, but it didn't come close. The third night, things changed. It was just after sundown. I'd hiked farther that day, trying to follow a narrow ravine that dipped south behind the cabin. I lost track of time and didn't make it back until dusk. By the time I got to the cabin, the light had drained from the sky, and the temperature dropped fast. I was out of breath and sweating, but it didn't take long to cool down. I didn't bother lighting a fire right away. I used my flashlight to prep a quick dinner, and then I stepped back outside to pee. That's when I noticed something. There were prints, barefoot human prints, in the patch of dirt near the woodpile. They weren't mine. I'd been wearing boots all day, and I hadn't been over there since yesterday. But these were fresh. The ground was slightly wet from dew, and they had that soft, just stepped in look to them. I crouched down and studied them. The prints were narrow, longer than average, and the toes were spread a little wider than normal. It didn't look like a child's footprint, and it didn't look right for an adult either. Something about the way the arch was almost missing. It was strange. I didn't panic, but my brain didn't like it. I turned and scanned the woods around me. It was quiet, way too quiet. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe someone had camped nearby. Maybe it was just some backcountry wanderer. Still, I grabbed the hatchet I'd brought and set it next to my sleeping bag before climbing in for the night. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up at random intervals, each time with the feeling that something had moved just outside the cabin. There's no real way to describe it. I didn't hear anything concrete, just the sense of a shift, like a weight in the air that changed. At around 2 or 3 a.m., I heard what I thought were footsteps moving across the porch. Slow, deliberate. No animals I've ever heard move like that. It was the sound of someone putting weight down, heel to toe. I held my breath. The steps stopped, and I didn't hear anything else. I didn't even blink. I stayed still for what felt like an hour, staring at the dark ceiling. Eventually, I dozed off. The next morning, there were no tracks on the porch, but that didn't mean much. The porch boards were old and dry. They wouldn't show anything unless it rained. I went out and circled the cabin. Near the back corner, I saw more of the same prints from the night before. They led into the woods but stopped abruptly after about 20 feet. I followed them, heart hammering, but they just vanished. No branch snapped, no signs of a path, just gone. I went farther into the woods that day than I had before. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing. I carried my hunting knife in one hand and a small can of bear spray in the other, not because I expected to need them, but because I felt better holding them. I didn't find anyone or anything, but I did find a strange pile of animal bones stacked neatly near a tree stump. Not buried, just sitting there like someone had gathered them and placed them there intentionally. That night, the wind picked up. It came in gusts that howled through the gaps in the walls and made the cabin groan. I lit a fire and stayed awake reading until my eyes couldn't stay open anymore. At around midnight, I heard something bang hard against the back wall. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed the hatchet. The fire had burned low, just embers now. I didn't move. I just listened. Another bang, this time on the side, followed by what sounded like dragging, like something heavy being pulled across dirt. I jumped up and moved to the window, but the darkness outside was too deep to see anything. I waited. The sound stopped. I stood there for maybe 20 minutes before I finally climbed back into my bag, fully dressed and still holding the hatchet. Around dawn, I opened the door and stepped outside. Nothing looked disturbed. No signs of dragging, no marks on the walls. But then I noticed something new. Wedged into the edge of the porch railing was a clump of matted brown hair. It wasn't animal hair. It was coarse, too long, and looked more like it had been torn from a scalp. My stomach turned. I knew then I couldn't stay. I packed my things fast and shoved them into my bag. I didn't bother cleaning the dishes or folding my blanket. I just got everything I could carry and left. I didn't even lock the door behind me. The trail back felt different. The woods felt heavier. I kept turning around, convinced something was following me. At one point, I stopped dead in my tracks because I heard it, just barely, the sound of branches cracking behind me. Not loud, but deliberate. I stood there, frozen, and after maybe 20 seconds of silence, I took off. I didn't care how tired I got. I jogged the rest of the trail until I saw the creek bed and my Jeep beyond it. When I got to the vehicle, I tossed my bag in the back, jumped in, and slammed the doors. I sat there, panting, looking in the rearview mirror at the woods. Then I started the engine and drove. I didn't stop until I got back to Pagosa Springs, where I booked a motel room for the night. I slept with the lights on. The next day, I called the property owner. I didn't go into details. I just told him someone might be squatting near the cabin, and he should check it out. He didn't sound surprised. He thanked me and said he'd look into it. I never heard back from him. A few weeks later, I was back at work, sitting in my office, and I decided to do a little research. I started digging into reports from that area. Missing persons, hikers who had gotten lost, old news stories. I found 3 over the last 10 years. All of them were solo hikers, and all of them vanished within the general region I'd been in. No bodies were ever found, just empty campsites or abandoned gear. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not the full story. Not until now. I don't believe in monsters or shapeshifters or any of that tribal legend stuff. But I believe people can become something else if they stay out in the wild too long. If they cut themselves off completely. I believe some minds can slip, especially when they're alone for years. I believe there are people out there who don't want to be found. People who watch and wait and take when the chance is right. I think what I saw, what I heard, was a person. Maybe not completely right in the head. Maybe someone who's been out there long enough to forget what it means to be human. Someone who walks barefoot in the dirt and stacks bones just for the hell of it. Someone who waits for hikers like me. And I'll never go back there. Not to that cabin. Not to those hills. I'll camp again someday, maybe, but never alone. Never in a place where the trees are too quiet. Where the wind sounds like breathing. And where bare footprints appear in the dirt overnight. I got lucky. I left before it got worse. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed another night, but I'm not interested in finding out. I was 28 when it happened. It was the fall of 2019. The air had started to cool down in the mountains of northern Idaho, and I had some time off work after finishing a long job in Spokane. I'd been working nonstop on a construction crew for over 6 months, and my forearms were sore every day from the constant lifting and drilling. A break felt earned. I didn't want to spend my time off at home, though. I needed space. No fones, no e-mails, no noise. I remembered a cabin my uncle had told me about years back. He had leased it once with a few of his old military buddies. It wasn't really owned by anyone anymore. Some land management agency kept it on record, but nobody had lived there in years. He said they just hiked in, stayed a week, cleaned up after themselves, and left. It was far out, nearly a 3-hour drive from the closest gas station, and then a 3-mile hike through thick forest trails, mostly used by hunters. That sounded perfect to me. I packed up my gear the night before I left. My old canvas tent, just in case the cabin was a bust, a couple tarps, a .357 revolver my dad gave me when I turned 20, 3 days worth of canned food, a water filter, matches, a first aid kit, and some other basic survival stuff. I drove my old '03 Tacoma into town and filled up the tank, grabbed a thermos of black coffee and 2 breakfast burritos, and hit the road at sunrise. By the time I reached the end of the logging road that led toward the trailhead, the sky had clouded over and the wind was picking up. It smelled like wet pine and dry leaves, that thick, musky fall scent. I locked the truck and started hiking. The trail was muddy in places, dry in others, and winding enough to keep me guessing where I was half the time. I had the route on a map in my backpack, but I knew if I kept heading west and downhill for the last half mile, I'd find it. And I did. The cabin sat low between 2 ridges, tucked behind a wall of thick trees and overgrown bushes. It was darker than I remembered it being in pictures, the wood aged and gray. Moss grew on one side of the slanted roof. The front door had a rusted metal latch and a small window with spiderwebs inside. I stood for a while just looking at it. It didn't feel creepy at that moment. Felt peaceful. Inside, it was dusty and cold. The single room held a wooden bunk bed, a broken rocking chair, an old iron stove, and a table with one uneven leg. Mouse droppings were in one corner. I opened all the windows to air it out and swept the floor with a pine branch I found out back. I laid out my sleeping bag on the bottom bunk and spent the afternoon collecting firewood. The silence was deep out there. No traffic, no voices, just the wind brushing through the branches and the occasional bird. That first night, I lit a fire in the stove and ate chili straight from the can. It was the first time I had fully relaxed in months. I stayed up late just sitting there, staring at the flickering orange flames inside the stove, listening to the wood crackle and pop. At one point, I thought I heard something outside, like a branch snapping, but I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon and didn't think twice about it. I woke up around 6 the next morning to the sound of light rain tapping the metal roof. I made coffee over the fire and hiked around for a bit with my revolver on my hip, mostly out of habit. I walked maybe 2 miles through the hills, checking out tracks and looking for deer. Saw some fresh ones but didn't spot anything live. I felt good, alive in a way I hadn't in a long time. It was around the 3rd night that things started to feel off. I'd made a small campfire in a ring of rocks outside the cabin after dinner. The rain had stopped and the sky was black with no moon. I sat on a log, just staring into the fire again when I heard it, branches snapping. Not just one, but several slowly, like someone was walking through the woods. I froze and looked up. Nothing, just dark trees. I stood and waited, my hand on my revolver. No more sounds. I walked around the fire, stared into the trees, even called out once just to hear my own voice. Nothing answered. I went inside, locked the door, and laid in the bunk, staring at the ceiling. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up thinking I heard footsteps on the porch. Every time I looked out the window, there was nothing. The next morning, I found something strange. A boot print in the soft dirt near the back of the cabin. Too big to be mine, wider too. Definitely not mine. My boots had a thin tread. This one had a deep lug pattern. I tried to tell myself maybe it was old, from a hunter weeks ago. Maybe even from me and I just didn't recognize it somehow. But it looked fresh. The edge was clean. I crouched and stared at it for a long time. That afternoon I didn't go far. I stayed close, chopping extra wood, keeping the fire going. I checked the perimeter of the cabin twice. Nothing else seemed off, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept glancing at the woods, like I was expecting someone to step out. That night, I didn't start a fire outside. I stayed in the cabin and kept the stove lit. I put the revolver next to my pillow and slept in my clothes. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, I woke up again. No sound this time, just a feeling. My skin was cold and tight, my neck stiff. I listened, then I heard it. A slow, soft creak, like wood being stepped on. I held my breath. The porch. I was sure of it. I sat up and reached for the revolver. The cabin was pitch black except for the dim red glow from the stove. I didn't move for almost a full minute. Then I stood and stepped to the window, carefully pulled back the curtain. Nothing, just trees. I waited another few minutes, then went back to bed, gun in hand. Didn't sleep after that. At sunrise, I stepped outside. There were more prints in the mud, same deep tread, moving around the side of the cabin and toward the woods. My stomach tightened. Whoever it was had walked around while I was sleeping. I packed up most of my gear that morning. I was planning to leave the next day anyway, but now I wanted out. I didn't feel safe anymore. I stayed on edge the whole day, ate cold beans and granola, kept checking over my shoulder. My heart was pounding for no reason. That night, I left the lantern off. No fire. I wanted the cabin to look empty from the outside. I laid on the floor beside the stove, where I could see the door and hear every sound. Gun loaded, safety off. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. This time, more than one step. Soft, slow steps. Then a scrape like something dragging on the wood. My hands started shaking. I crawled to the window and peeked out. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I saw him. He was standing maybe 10 feet from the porch. A big man, not huge but broad, wearing a thick brown coat. His head was shaved. He was just staring at the cabin, not moving. I ducked down. I could hear my own breath, ragged and loud. I thought I was going to throw up. I stayed down for what felt like hours. When I looked again, he was gone. I didn't sleep. I waited for the sun. When it came, I threw everything in my pack, grabbed the revolver, and left. I didn't clean up, didn't leave a note. I hiked fast, almost running. The whole time, I felt like I was being followed. I kept turning around, scanning the trees. I made it to my truck just after noon. The back window was smashed, glove box open, stuff thrown everywhere. I opened the driver's side door and saw something lying on the seat. A hunting knife, a big one, clean, like it had just been placed there. I started the engine and drove as fast as I could down the logging road, tires bouncing, engine whining. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station near Sandpoint. I went inside, washed my face in the bathroom, then sat in the truck for a long time just staring at the sky. I didn't report it. What would I say? Some man followed me, maybe broke into my truck, stared at my cabin, left a knife. I kept that knife, still have it. I think about that man a lot. The way he just stood there, the way he didn't move. I don't know what he wanted. Maybe just to scare me, maybe more than that. All I know is I haven't gone back to the woods since, and I never will. It had been a long time since I had stepped away from the city. Work had consumed me in ways I couldn't explain, and I had been desperate for a break. The constant grind had worn me down, and so I decided to take a weekend trip to a small cabin tucked away in the middle of nowhere. The location was near a small, barely remembered graveyard. From the moment I looked it up, something about it seemed peaceful. Or at least that was what I told myself before I packed up and left. The drive was quiet, the kind of silence that made you think, made you reflect, but not necessarily in a comforting way. I was 28, living in a bustling city, but this cabin was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where I could clear my head. The air felt different as soon as I left the highway. The familiar hum of traffic and city sounds faded, replaced by the rhythmic sound of my tires on gravel. The directions were simple enough. A little turn off the main road, a long, winding drive through some rough terrain, and then a final stretch of road that seemed to lead straight into nowhere. I didn't really know much about the place. It was a recommendation from a colleague who'd mentioned it offhand one day. A quiet escape, an old family-owned cabin that had been standing for decades. It was isolated, not many people visited, which was part of the appeal. The cabin came into view just as the sun began to dip below the trees. It was a small, one-story structure with a slanted roof and weathered wood. It looked older than I had imagined, but that only added to its charm. There was a thick layer of moss growing along the roof, and the windows had a slight fog on the inside, perhaps from years of condensation. A small porch with a single rocking chair greeted me at the entrance. I grabbed my bag from the car, taking in the smell of damp earth and the faint scent of pine that seemed to seep through the air. I took a deep breath, soaking in the quiet. The silence here was different from city silence. It wasn't the emptiness of an abandoned place, but the sort of silence that comes from something untouched by time. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It wasn't unnerving, but it was strange. My phone had no signal out here, which I expected. That was part of the draw. I was alone, and it felt like I was entering a world where time had slowed down. I fumbled with the keys the cabin owner had left for me, trying to open the door. The old lock gave a bit of resistance before it clicked open. The inside was as rustic as the outside. A small living room with a stone fireplace, a couple of mismatched chairs, and a single window that looked out into the woods. The kitchen was tucked into the corner, and the bathroom was simple. A small bedroom was off to the side, with an old iron bed frame covered in a quilt. I set my things down on the bed and stretched, feeling a strange sense of both relief and restlessness. I had no plans for the evening, no agenda. The cabin itself was my plan. I decided to head out for a quick walk, to explore the surroundings and clear my head a bit before nightfall. The graveyard wasn't far. It was just beyond a few overgrown trees, barely visible unless you were looking for it. I had read about it online, but I hadn't expected it to be so quiet. The gravestones were old, some barely standing, others half sunken into the earth. The names were worn away by time, and a few had moss creeping up their sides, adding to the eerie atmosphere. There were no flowers, no fresh graves, nothing to indicate that anyone still visited this place. It was as if the past had been forgotten here. I wandered through the graveyard for a while, feeling an odd sense of connection. It wasn't sadness or fear that gripped me, but a kind of quiet contemplation. I wondered about the people who had been buried here, who they were, how they lived, and why they ended up in this forsaken place. The day was fading into twilight, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer. I didn't have any particular reason to linger, but I couldn't bring myself to leave just yet. That's when I noticed something strange. A figure in the distance, just beyond the furthest rows of gravestones. At first, I thought it was someone else visiting the graveyard, maybe another wanderer who had come for peace or reflection. But something about the figure didn't feel right. It stood still, unnaturally still, as if frozen in place. My heart began to race, and I told myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, the wind moving in strange ways, or even an animal in the trees. But the figure didn't move. I stood there for a while, watching, until the sun dipped low enough to make everything seem darker than it should have been. I turned to leave, my legs feeling heavier with every step. The trees seemed to grow taller, casting long, menacing shadows across the graveyard. I could feel the air change, as if the world had become a little thicker, a little more suffocating. I thought I heard something behind me, a rustle, a snap of a twig, but when I looked back, nothing was there. The figure was gone, and the graveyard was empty, save for the gravestones and the wind that howled through the trees. I made my way back to the cabin, my thoughts clouded with unease. As I reached the door, I glanced back toward the graveyard, half expecting to see something moving in the distance. But there was nothing. The cabin felt even more isolated now, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. I locked the door behind me and drew the curtains, trying to shake off the strange feeling that lingered in the pit of my stomach. Night fell, and the wind began to pick up, howling through the trees. The cabin creaked in response to the gusts, and the fire I had started crackled in the hearth. I sat there, in the dim light, watching the flames dance. My mind kept returning to that figure in the graveyard, but every time I tried to push the thought away, it came back stronger. I was overthinking it, I told myself. It was just my imagination running wild. But then, just as I began to settle, I heard a sound. A soft knocking at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again, louder this time, almost deliberate. My heart skipped a beat, and I found myself frozen, staring at the door. The knocking continued, steady and rhythmic, like someone was waiting outside. I stood up slowly, as if moving too quickly might make it all real. My hand hovered near the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. The knocking stopped suddenly, and for a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. I exhaled, trying to steady my nerves, and opened the door just a crack, peering out into the darkness. No one. The wind was the only thing that stirred the trees, and the night seemed unnaturally still. I stepped outside, looking around.
No footsteps.
No signs of anyone. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing. I closed the door and locked it again, leaning against it as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it was just an animal or some strange sound from the wind. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hours passed slowly, and I stayed by the fire, trying to keep myself occupied. But the unease wouldn't go away. I could still hear the wind howling outside, but it had changed, becoming more erratic, almost as if it was trying to communicate. The house felt smaller now, the walls closing in around me. I felt like I was being watched, like there was someone just beyond the threshold, waiting. But as the night wore on, the sounds outside faded, and the pressure in the air lifted. By the time the sun began to rise, I felt a sense of relief. The morning light seemed to wash away the darkness of the previous night. I stepped outside, and the graveyard looked different in the daylight. Less intimidating, less oppressive. It was just a place, a quiet part of the world that had been forgotten. There were no figures in the distance, no shadows that lingered too long. I spent the rest of the day hiking through the surrounding woods, clearing my mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. When I returned to the cabin that evening, I packed my things and decided it was time to leave. The place had served its purpose, giving me space to think, but it was time to move on. I didn't know what I had experienced, but I knew I didn't want to stick around to find out. The drive back was peaceful, the roads empty, the world wide open. I could still hear the wind in my ears, but I wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever had happened out there in the graveyard, whether it was a trick of the light, an overactive imagination, or something else, I didn't need to know. The cabin was behind me now, and I was heading back to the world I knew. As I left that small, isolated part of the world, I couldn't help but feel that I had learned something. Something about solitude, about the past, and about the strange ways the mind works when you're left alone in the dark. But most importantly, I learned that sometimes a peaceful escape isn't just about being away from the world. It's about confronting what lies in the quiet, what's hidden beneath the surface, and understanding that you can't escape everything, not even when you're alone in the middle of nowhere. And with that thought, I drove away, knowing that the experience would stay with me long after I left. It was something I would never forget. I was 32 the year I took some time off work and went up to a cabin near Keswick in Cumbria. It was October 2019. I was living alone in Sheffield at the time, and between the long hours at work and the constant hum of traffic, I'd started feeling like I needed a break from everything. I didn't want to travel abroad or go anywhere expensive. I just wanted silence, trees, cold air, something that didn't talk back at me or expect anything from me. I found the cabin online. It was small, off a narrow, unpaved road that twisted away from the main routes into the hills. The listing said it had no neighbors for at least half a mile. It had a wood-burning stove, basic kitchen, hot water, and solar panels that powered the lights and sockets.
No Wi-Fi.
No phone signal. I booked it for 9 nights. The drive took just under 4 hours. When I pulled into the little dirt parking area next to the cabin, the sun was already low, painting the hills in gold and shadow. The cabin was older than I expected, with moss along the wooden shingles and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. But it was quiet. I stepped out of the car, and for the first time in months, I heard nothing but the wind. I remember standing there for a while with my hands in my jacket pockets, just breathing it all in. Inside, the place was basic but comfortable. It smelled faintly of old wood and the soot from the stove. There was a single bed in the back, a bathroom with a compost toilet, and a tiny kitchen with just enough room to turn around. I unpacked slowly, moving my gear in from the car, stacking groceries in the narrow fridge, and putting a few books on the windowsill. By the time I was done, it was fully dark. The silence outside had taken on a new weight. It wasn't like the silence you get in cities. This was thick, almost physical. You could hear the wind brushing over the trees and the occasional knock of a branch against the siding. But that was it. The first night passed quietly. I read until the stove made the cabin too warm, then stripped down to my boxers and lay on the bed listening to the sound of the fire slowly dying. I remember thinking, this is exactly what I needed. On the third evening, something odd happened. I'd spent the day walking through a trail about 2 miles east of the cabin. It looped through forest and low hills, and I'd brought a flask of coffee and some sandwiches. By the time I got back, the sun had dropped behind the clouds, and the air had turned sharp. I went inside, made a quick dinner, and sat on the little front step with a cup of tea in my hands. The sky was pale gray, full of moving clouds. The wind had picked up, and the trees to the north of the clearing were swaying slightly. I was about to go back in when I noticed movement near the edge of the treeline. At first I thought it was a deer or something else on 4 legs, but as I squinted, I saw a figure. It was a woman. She was standing still about 30 yards away, right where the clearing ended and the forest began. She was facing the cabin. I couldn't see her face, just the shape of her. She was wearing a coat that looked too thin for the weather, and her arms were hanging stiff at her sides. Her hair was long and dark and looked messy, blowing around in the breeze. I froze where I was, my mug still in my hands. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. After maybe 10 or 15 seconds, she turned and walked back into the trees. Not fast, just turned slowly and walked away. I waited. A minute passed, then 2. Nothing. Just the wind and the trees. I stood up and stepped inside. I locked the door, then checked the back window. Nothing. No sign of her. I tried to tell myself she was probably a hiker who got lost or maybe someone from a nearby house. But the truth was, there weren't any nearby houses. I'd driven that road. There was nothing around here.
No farms.
No small cottages. The nearest building was back down the hill, past the gate and along the dirt track that led to the main road, and that place was empty when I passed it. Boarded up windows, overgrown grass. Still, I slept fine that night.
No sounds. No knocks.
Just silence. The next morning, I stepped outside early with my coffee and looked toward the woods. No sign of her. No footprints, but the ground was covered in pine needles and moss, so that didn't mean much. I didn't go out hiking that day. I stayed close to the cabin, chopped some wood, made lunch, did a bit of writing on my laptop. Around 5, I walked down the track toward the old gate where the cabin's property ended. There was a rusted sign nailed to a tree there, something about private land and no trespassing. I stood there a while, then turned around and walked back. When I got back, I noticed something small but strange. One of the wooden chairs outside had been turned to face the woods. I knew I hadn't left it that way. I walked up to it and looked around. No footprints, no marks in the dirt. I picked it up and brought it inside. Locked the door. That night, I didn't sleep as well. The silence started to feel unnatural, like it was waiting for something. 2 more days passed. Each morning, I'd scan the trees. Each night, I locked the door and drew the curtain. The woods never made a sound.
No birds.
No animals. Just wind and trees. On the 6th night, I woke up around 2:30 in the morning. I don't know what woke me. The cabin was dead quiet. I lay there in bed, blinking into the dark, trying to understand what felt wrong. Then I heard it, a creak. It was soft, faint, like the sound of someone putting weight on an old wooden board. It came from the side of the cabin, near the front door. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. Silence. Then, another creak, closer this time. I stood up and moved carefully to the window beside the door. I kept the lights off. I lifted the edge of the curtain just a bit. She was standing on the porch. She was right there, 2 feet from the door, still, facing the window. Her face was pale in the moonlight, but her features were hard to make out. Her eyes were wide. Her mouth looked wrong. It was slightly open, but not in surprise or fear, just open. She didn't move. I let the curtain fall and backed away. I waited there for what felt like hours. I didn't hear her walk away. No more creaks. Nothing. When I looked again, she was gone. That morning, I found something that chilled me in a way I didn't expect. Just a small thing. On the porch, right where she had been standing, was a long, thin hair, black, curled slightly at the end. I hadn't seen her clearly, but I knew it was hers. I didn't touch it. I packed my bag that morning. I threw everything into the boot of the car and drove down that dirt road as fast as I could without blowing a tire. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. Even then, I kept checking the mirror. I didn't go straight home. I checked into a Premier Inn in Penrith and stayed there 2 nights, trying to calm down. I kept thinking I'd overreacted, that maybe she was just mentally ill or lost or confused. But then I remembered the hair, the chair, the creaking steps. I remembered her mouth. I called the letting agent I'd used and told them something strange had happened at the cabin. They sounded confused. They said nobody else had rented it in weeks. They didn't seem concerned. 3 months later, I was back at work. Life felt normal again. But sometimes when I can't sleep, I think about her, about how she moved, about how she just stood there. I've looked online. I've searched for any missing persons, any local stories about strange people near Keswick or Cumbria. Nothing. But here's the thing that really stuck with me. About a week after I got back to Sheffield, I opened my bag to find a single black hair curled at the bottom of one of my socks. I stared at it for a long time. I flushed it down the toilet. I've never gone back to that part of the country. I never will. That cabin is probably still there. The listing's gone. Maybe someone else is staying there now. Maybe she's still watching from the woods. Or maybe she's not in the woods anymore. Maybe she's somewhere else. Maybe she's still following the ones who see her. Quiet, still, mouth just a little too wide. I was 29 when I decided to get away. Life had been nothing but a blur of noise and stress. The job, the city, the constant hum of people and their demands. It was overwhelming. So when I found an old cabin for rent in the middle of nowhere, tucked away in the vast forests of Montana, I jumped at the chance. A break, a quiet retreat, a few days by myself, far from everything. The kind of reset that seemed impossible to get in the busy life I had. The cabin was small, just a few rooms, but it had everything I needed. A worn couch by the fireplace, a kitchen with a gas stove, and a small bedroom with a single bed and an old wooden dresser. I loved the look of it. The wood was aged, the walls lined with a deep pine scent that almost felt like it belonged to the land itself. The owners told me it had been in the family for generations, and they only rented it out occasionally. Most people didn't make it far enough to reach the place, given how rough the terrain was. I didn't mind that. I liked the isolation. It gave me peace, a kind of quiet I hadn't had in a long time. The first night I was there, the skies were clear. No light pollution. I could see every star above. It was beautiful, almost unreal. The wind outside howled through the trees, and the occasional creak of the cabin settled me into a strange sense of calm. The cabin, though old, felt sturdy. I felt safe, tucked inside with nothing but the soft crackling of the fire to break the silence. I spent most of the first day walking around the area. It was a dense forest, thick with evergreens and pines. The trail around the cabin was well worn, but the deeper you went into the woods, the less traveled it seemed. The quiet of it all was almost oppressive. There was no sound of birds, no rustling animals, just the constant hum of the wind. As I wandered farther, I came across a clearing. At the far side, there was a broken-down shack. It looked ancient, abandoned, and I wondered why anyone would build something so far out in the middle of nowhere. The wood was rotted in some places, and the roof sagged like it hadn't been touched in decades. I didn't go inside. It felt wrong to, like disturbing a secret better left untouched. That night, I stayed close to the cabin. I cooked a simple dinner, the kind of meal I could make without effort. Pasta with canned sauce and a few spices. I sat by the fire, sipping a glass of cheap red wine and watching the flames dance. But as the hours wore on, I began to feel uneasy. It was subtle at first, just a quiet prickling at the back of my neck. The kind of sensation you get when you feel like someone's watching you, but you can't figure out who. The wind had died down, and everything outside was completely still. The fire in the fireplace popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and that was when I heard it, the faintest sound. A knock. It was light, like someone tapping their knuckles against the door. I stood up quickly, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I walked to the door cautiously, my hand resting on the handle. The knock came again, this time more insistent, as if someone was waiting on the other side. I pulled the door open just a crack, my eyes scanning the dark. But there was no one there. The night air was cold, biting against my skin. I stepped outside, looking around. The cabin was surrounded by a thick veil of darkness, the trees only faint silhouettes in the blackness. I called out, but no answer came. I couldn't hear anything but the sound of my own voice echoing in the still air. I checked the yard, behind the cabin, and even around the corner, nothing. I chalked it up to nerves, the kind of thing that can happen when you're alone in the woods. Maybe it was an animal or the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just been out there. Something waiting, something unseen. I shut the door behind me, double-locked it, and went back to the fire. But sleep was a long time coming. The second day passed uneventfully. I spent most of it walking deeper into the woods, trying to lose the strange feeling that had crept into my thoughts the night before. The air was thick with fog, and it seemed to cling to everything. The trees looked taller in the mist, like they were watching me. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was setting. The clouds had rolled in, and the wind was picking up again. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, just to be sure I could see if anything unexpected happened. My mind had already started playing tricks on me, so I figured I might as well prepare for the worst. That night, the knock came again. It was so quiet at first that I almost dismissed it. Then it came again, one soft tap, then another. I froze, my heart pounding. Couldn't believe it. I'd locked the door. There was no one else here. I couldn't be hearing this. I waited, listening for any other sounds, but there was nothing. The wind howled outside, but that was it. Slowly, I stood, my legs feeling like they were made of stone. I approached the door, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam of light flickered across the wood, casting strange shadows across the floor. Then came the knock again, this time harder, like someone was slamming their fist against the door. I threw open the door, ready to shout at whoever it was. But once again, the porch was empty. Nothing, just the empty space of the yard stretching out into the dark. I stepped outside this time, my flashlight sweeping over the area. The light caught something, footprints, fresh ones, barefoot heading into the woods. They were faint, as if someone had tried to walk softly, but they were there. I followed them, my mind racing. The further I went into the trees, the more the feeling of dread grew. The air was colder here, and the trees seemed to close in tighter. I almost expected to hear someone behind me, but all I could hear was my own breathing. The footsteps led to the old shack I'd seen the day before. They stopped there, right in front of the door. I hesitated. There was no way I was going inside, but I had to know who or what had been out here. What kind of person would be wandering the woods barefoot, in the middle of the night with no flashlight or gear? I could feel my pulse in my ears, and every part of me wanted to turn back, but I kept pushing forward. I approached the door of the shack and reached out to touch it. As my hand made contact with the old wood, I heard a rustling noise behind me, followed by a faint whisper. My heart skipped. I spun around, but there was nothing there. No one. I ran back to the cabin. I locked the door again and sat by the fire, my hands shaking. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know what I had heard or what I had seen, but something was wrong. Something had been out there, and I wasn't alone. I spent the next few hours checking every window, every door. My mind raced, imagining everything from prowlers to wild animals to whatever else could be lurking in the dark. When dawn finally broke, I decided it was time to leave. I had planned to stay a few more days, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe here anymore. I packed my things quickly, feeling the weight of the strange night pressing on my chest. When I left, I didn't look back. I drove away without a second thought. As I drove down the dirt road, the trees parted, and I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. It was just for a second, a flash of movement, but it was enough. Someone was standing in the woods, just inside the tree line, watching me leave. I never found out who or what had been out there, but when I reached the main road, I didn't stop until I was back in the city. I don't know if I'll ever go back. Something about that cabin, about the way it made me feel like I was being watched, like I was never really alone, stays with me. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that knock in my mind. But I'm safe now, and I know better than to go looking for something I can't explain. I was 34 when I decided to take a break from everything. It was late September 2021, and I'd just gone through a rough patch. Some things in my personal life were falling apart, and work had been eating me alive. I needed to get away, not to drink or go on some wild vacation, but to clear my head. Just me and my dog, Rocco. He's a 6-year-old black Labrador, loyal as they come. He's been with me through a lot. Whenever things got hard, Rocco was the one constant that grounded me. I didn't want to go to a campground or any place with people. I wanted isolation, no phone signal, no neighbors, no noise. I remembered my uncle used to own a cabin in northern Idaho, near the edge of the Kaniksu National Forest. It was old, real old, built in the 70s, and he hadn't used it in years. After he passed, the property went to my cousin James, who lived in Oregon and didn't care much for it. When I asked if I could borrow it for a week or two, he said, "Sure, if you can find a way to get there." That was the first red flag I ignored. I loaded up my old SUV with enough supplies for 2 weeks. Cans of soup, bags of rice, coffee, beef jerky, bottled water, and stuff for Rocco. His food, extra leashes, a reflective vest, even a new bedroll. I brought a small generator, some tools, my hunting knife, and a .22 rifle. Not because I expected trouble, but because it was bear country. I grew up around woods, and I knew the kind of things that could go wrong out there. Took me nearly 10 hours to reach the area. The last few miles were on a rough dirt road that hadn't been maintained in years. Trees grew in from the sides, slapping the SUV with their branches. It was almost evening by the time I saw the cabin. It looked exactly how I remembered it, just older, more sun-bleached, more forgotten. It sat about 100 feet back from a dry creek bed, surrounded by pines. The logs were faded gray, and moss crept up the lower edges. The windows were still intact, though dusty, and the front porch sagged slightly on one corner. There was a small woodshed out back, still stacked with chopped logs from God knows when. No tire tracks, no trash, no signs of recent human presence. Inside, it was dusty but dry. One main room with a wood stove, a small table, a kitchenette that ran along the back wall, and a cot pushed against the left corner. There was an old cooler under the counter, a rusted sink that connected to a gravity-fed tank up on a ridge behind the cabin, and a narrow closet that used to be a bathroom back when the plumbing still worked. The place smelled like pine and old metal. I cleaned it up a bit, opened some windows, and let Rocco sniff everything. He seemed excited at first, wagging his tail, sticking his nose in corners, then slowly settling down once he realized this was where we were staying. I cooked a quick meal on the portable stove and sat out on the porch as the sun dipped behind the trees. There was no phone signal, no internet, just the distant sound of birds and wind through the branches. It was exactly what I wanted. The first 2 days were uneventful in the best possible way. I hiked with Rocco through the surrounding woods, made a fire in the evenings, read from an old paperback I found in the cabin, and slept more soundly than I had in months. There were deer trails all around, and I even saw a moose in the distance once. No people, not even far-off engine sounds, just nature. But on the third night, something changed. Started around 2 a.m. I woke up to Rocco growling, not barking, growling low from his chest, the way dogs do when something's nearby but not close enough to trigger panic. I sat up on the cot, heart pounding. It was pitch dark inside the cabin. I fumbled for the flashlight I kept on the side table and flicked it on. Rocco was standing near the door, hackles raised, staring at the window. I turned off the light immediately. Whoever or whatever it was out there didn't need to know I was awake. I got up slowly and crept to the window. Nothing. Just the outline of trees against the moonlight. I waited, barely breathing. Rocco's growl deepened for a moment, then faded. He turned and looked at me like he was unsure. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no animals, no twigs snapping. After about 20 minutes, I climbed back into bed. Rocco lay down, still facing the door, ears twitching. The next morning, I chalked it up to an animal. Maybe a coyote had passed nearby or something else. Still, it stuck in my mind. I checked the area around the cabin and saw no tracks, not even deer prints. That struck me as strange. This deep in the woods, you usually saw something. Later that day, I took Rocco for a hike up the ridge behind the cabin. I remembered there was an old hunting blind up there, built years ago by my uncle. The trail was still faintly visible under the leaves and pine needles. When we got to the blind, I noticed it had partially collapsed. The plywood roof sagged, but it still offered a good view of the valley below. That's when I noticed the clearing. It was maybe a quarter-mile away, hidden behind a thick wall of fir trees. It didn't look natural, too symmetrical. It was rectangular, maybe 50 feet across, and had a slight depression in the center. From where I stood, I could barely make out what looked like black plastic or tarps on the ground. My first thought was hunters. Maybe someone used that spot to camp or process game. I decided to check it out the next day. When I reached the clearing around noon, I knew instantly something was wrong. It wasn't a campsite. The ground had been disturbed. Large patches of earth turned over, as if recently dug and recovered. There were tire tracks, deep ones, probably from a truck or ATV. The black tarps I'd seen weren't tarps at all. They were heavy-duty trash bags, thick, commercial grade. Some were tied up, some weren't. Inside one, partially open, I saw what looked like clothing, jeans, a boot, something dark stained around the ankle. Another bag had a torn seam. There was hair sticking out, long, black hair, clumped together like it had been wet. I froze. Every hair on my body stood up. Rocco started barking then. Sharp, alarmed, pacing around me. I grabbed his collar and backed away. I didn't open another bag. I didn't need to. I'd seen enough in my life to know what I was looking at. I ran back to the cabin. No phone signal, no satellite internet, no radio. I tried starting the SUV, but the battery was dead. I must have left the overhead light on the night before, though I didn't remember doing that. I had a small solar charger, but it would take hours to get enough juice for a single call if I even found signal. I thought about hiking out to the main road, but it was almost 10 miles through rough terrain. I locked all the doors, shoved furniture against them, and sat there with the rifle across my lap. Rocco wouldn't sit still. He paced the cabin, whined, barked at the windows. That night, just past 1 a.m., someone knocked. Not loud, not aggressive, just a quiet knock on the front door, like a delivery guy who didn't want to wake you. I didn't move. Rocco went silent and pressed against my leg. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't answer. I didn't look out the window. I sat there for 2 hours listening. Eventually, the knocking stopped, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I packed what I could in a backpack. I strapped my rifle across my chest, clipped Rocco's leash on, and left the rest behind. I didn't care about the gear. I just wanted out. I didn't take the road. I cut straight into the woods, using the sun to navigate. Rocco stayed close, sensing my fear. Every sound felt like it could be footsteps behind me. I didn't stop until the sun started going down. That night, I slept under a tree, rifle in hand. Rocco curled against me. I didn't make a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I barely slept. By midday the next day, I reached a logging road and flagged down a pickup. The driver, an older man hauling equipment, gave me water and a ride to the nearest ranger station. I told them everything. Authorities went back to the site. What they found was worse than I thought. Several shallow graves, human remains in different stages of decomposition. Articles of clothing, IDs, bags. The area had been used repeatedly over the years, but they didn't find the people responsible. There were no cameras, no trail cams, no fingerprints, just signs that someone had been there very recently. Fresh tire tracks, recent footprints. My SUV had been stripped and burned, found in a ravine half a mile from the cabin. They took my statement and told me to be cautious, that it was likely a dumping ground used by someone who knew the area well. Maybe multiple people, maybe hunters, maybe not. I never went back to that cabin. The property was sold later that year. Rocco and I moved south. I kept my job remote. I still hike, but only in public areas. Places with people. Places with cameras. I don't go more than a few miles in. Rocco's older now. His muzzle's graying, his energy a little lower. But when he growls at the window in the middle of the night, I listen. Because now I know. Some places stay quiet for a reason. It was the fall of 2016, and I was 31 years old when I finally decided to stop putting things off and build myself a small off-grid cabin. I've been dreaming of it for years, not for Instagram or some lifestyle blog, but because I just wanted a place to be alone sometimes. A place without power lines or sidewalks or distant hums of traffic. I worked as a welder in a small town near Roanoke, Virginia, and I had some land about 25 miles out that I bought back in 2013. 5 wooded acres with a sloped ridge and a half-cleared spot that I always imagined would be the perfect site for a cabin. I didn't have much saved, but I had just enough to get it started. I'd spent months hauling in lumber and supplies in my beat-up 1999 Silverado, picking up what I could afford week by week. I wasn't hiring anyone. I wanted to do it alone. I wasn't a builder, but I knew enough to get something simple done. A 12 by 12 with a slanted roof and a small loft.
No plumbing.
Just a rain catchment, maybe a wood stove one day and a cot or two. I had it all planned out in a notebook I kept on my nightstand. The weather had been decent all week, cool, overcast, but dry. I planned for a long weekend starting Friday night. I packed up everything I thought I'd need and left after work that afternoon. I brought my dog, Brutus, a 6-year-old mutt I'd raised from a pup. He was my only real company most days, and he loved it out there. Sniffing tree trunks, chasing squirrels, lying in the pine needles like a king. The idea was to get the floor frame and walls up by Sunday night, maybe even the roof if I pushed hard enough. I was excited. When we got to the land, it was already dark. I had a few solar lights I stuck in the dirt, and I pitched my tent in the flattest area near the clearing. The forest was quiet. Leaves were just starting to fall, and the smell of dry pine and dirt was everywhere. I made a small fire, heated up a can of chili, fed Brutus, and just sat under the stars for a while. That was the first night. The next morning, I got to work before sunrise. I dug in the foundation blocks, leveled them, and started framing the floor. I used 2x8s for the joists and ran them across with screws and brackets, checking every few steps to make sure everything was square. It was backbreaking work, and by lunch I was already sore, but I didn't care. Brutus stayed close by most of the time, sometimes wandering off a few yards and then circling back. Around 3 p.m., I noticed the clouds thickening in the sky, heavy gray ones, low and fast-moving. I knew there'd be rain, but I figured it'd pass. I worked faster, got the plywood subfloor down. Then I started raising the first of the walls, just the back wall with the window frame cut out. I didn't have any real cover built yet, so if it poured, I'd have to tarp it. That thought made me rush, and that's when mistakes started happening. I dropped a hammer on my shin. Then I cut my palm trying to drive a stubborn screw through wet wood. Nothing major, but it slowed me down. Then the wind picked up, and I heard thunder rolling somewhere off in the west. Brutus was pacing now, ears back, glancing at the tree line more often than usual. I started stapling the tarp over the frame, using scrap wood to anchor the sides. The rain came minutes later, cold and steady. Not a downpour at first, but enough to soak through a flannel shirt in 5 minutes. By 6:30, it was dark again. I had my lantern set up inside the open frame of the cabin, and my gear stowed under the tarp. My tent was still dry, and I set Brutus up in there with a blanket and some food. I stayed out under the tarp with the lantern and my notebook, writing down what I got done and what I'd do the next day. The rain got heavier, and by the time I crawled into the tent just after 9 p.m., the whole clearing was soft with mud. Water ran in little rivulets between the stumps and over the dirt, but I didn't care. This was part of it, I thought. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something outside. Not the rain. It was still coming down steady, but a sharp clatter like something metallic falling onto wood. My first thought was the ladder I left leaned against the frame. Maybe the wind knocked it down. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent. Brutus followed me out. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the whole clearing shimmered under the beam of my light. I panned it toward the cabin frame. The ladder was still up. Nothing looked out of place. I walked closer, checking around. Then I saw it. One of the buckets I used to carry nails and screws had been knocked over. Maybe I hadn't secured it. Maybe the wind rolled it. I tried to convince myself that's all it was. I picked it up, put it under the tarp again, and went back to the tent. But I didn't sleep well after that. Every snap of a branch or rustle of wet leaves had my ears perked. I kept the flashlight next to me, just in case. The next morning, the rain hadn't let up. I made coffee with my little propane burner and tried to get moving, but everything was damp. My hands ached, and the wood was slick. Brutus didn't want to leave the tent. I managed to get one more wall framed and stood up, but the mud made everything unstable. Twice, I nearly slipped carrying plywood. My boots were soaked, and the edges of my socks squished when I walked. By afternoon, the rain came heavier again. I started feeling uneasy, not scared, just watched. It didn't make sense. No one lived nearby. The nearest road was 2 miles out, and even that wasn't paved. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Brutus wouldn't leave my side now. He was tense, tail down, ears up. At one point, I looked up from the wall I was working on and saw him staring into the woods, frozen. I didn't hear or see anything, but I walked over and stood with him. We waited. Nothing happened.
No birds. No squirrels.
Just rain on the leaves. That night, I barely slept. I stayed in the tent, but I kept the lantern on low and my boots by the flap. Brutus curled beside me. The wind was louder now, and something kept creaking out by the frame. I thought about packing it in the next day, just until the weather passed. But I didn't want to quit. I wanted to finish. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps. I know how that sounds, but I've hunted.
I've hiked.
I know the difference between a raccoon and a man. These were slow, careful steps. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. I sat up fast and shut the lantern off. My flashlight was already in my hand. Brutus was growling, not barking, just that low, deep rumble he made when he didn't like something. I unzipped the flap and scanned the clearing. The beam caught the trees, the mud, the cabin frame, but nothing else. No eyes, no shapes, just rain and fog. I stepped out, heart thudding. I walked to the frame again. The tarp had been pulled partly off the roof. Tools scattered. My hammer was lying 5 feet away from where I left it. I didn't want to believe it, but someone had been there. I packed up at sunrise. I didn't even finish the walls. I loaded up my tools, tied down what I could, and got the hell out. The cabin was still just a frame, half covered in a shredded tarp, and I left it that way. When I got home, I didn't sleep for a full night in days. I kept thinking about those steps, about Brutus's growl. A week later, I went back with a friend from work. I didn't tell him what happened, just said I needed help finishing the job. The place was trashed. The tarp was gone. All the plywood I stacked under it was soaked or missing. The ladder was snapped. My tent had been slashed like someone cut it with a knife. I found prints in the mud, boot prints. Not mine. Bigger. Deeper. We didn't stay. We left, and I sold the land 2 months later. I never told anyone the full story. Not until now. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. Maybe it was a drifter or someone squatting, or just some psycho who lived in the woods. I still think about what would have happened if I hadn't packed up that morning. If I'd stayed another night. I never went back. I work in a different town now. I still think about building something again. Maybe somewhere else. But I haven't tried. Not yet. I was 32 when I decided to spend a week alone in a remote cabin deep in the forested hills of northern Idaho. It was mid-September, 2021. The summer heat had passed, and fall was settling in slowly. The leaves were just starting to change colors, and the mornings carried a crisp chill. I was dealing with some personal stuff that year. A long-term relationship had ended in June, and my job in Spokane had started to feel like a daily grind with no real direction. I figured a little solitude might clear my head. The cabin belonged to a friend's cousin who didn't use it much anymore. It was about a 3-hour drive from Coeur d'Alene, followed by another half-hour on an old logging road that twisted through pine trees and patches of overgrown brush. No cell service, no nearby towns, just the woods, a ravine, and the cabin sitting quietly in the middle of it all. It had running water from a natural spring, a wood stove, a propane tank for cooking, and a battery-powered radio. That was about it.
No Wi-Fi, no nachbors.
I arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. The sun was low, slicing between the trees, lighting up the dust kicked up by my tires. The cabin was smaller than I expected. It looked older too. The wood siding was faded, and the tin roof had patches of rust. The front porch sagged a little, and some of the railing was missing. But it had charm. The air smelled like pine needles and dirt, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a little calm. I spent the first evening unpacking, chopping some wood, and reading a book by lantern light. I could hear nothing outside except for the occasional creak of the trees and the wind brushing against the walls. There were no footsteps, no engines, no voices. It was peaceful. At night, it got cold fast. I stoked the fire and curled up in a heavy sleeping bag on the old cot in the corner. The windows had no curtains, just screens. I remember staring out at the black forest and thinking about how complete the silence was. The second day, I hiked around the area. There was a narrow trail behind the cabin that led through some thick pines and eventually curved down toward a shallow ravine. The ravine wasn't very deep, maybe 10 feet, but it was wide in some places, and the sides were steep enough that you couldn't just walk down easily without slipping. At the bottom, there was a little creek that trickled through the rocks and disappeared into the trees. I followed it for a while, then cut back uphill when I realized I hadn't marked my trail. I was back at the cabin by late afternoon, sweaty and scratched up but satisfied. I made some canned chili on the propane stove, cleaned up with some wet wipes, and spent the evening writing in a notebook. I wasn't a writer or anything, but I felt like getting things out of my head. That night, I went to sleep early, but that's when the mood shifted. I woke up around 2 a.m. It wasn't the kind of waking where you slowly drift out of sleep. It was sudden, like something inside me knew something was wrong. The fire was just glowing embers. It was cold. I sat up in my sleeping bag and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything, just the ticking of the stove as it cooled. Then I thought I heard a crunch outside, like footsteps on dead leaves. I froze. I held my breath. The sound came again, slower this time. One step, then another, then silence. I waited maybe 5 full minutes, listening as hard as I could. Nothing. No more steps. No movement. I got up as quietly as I could and walked to the window. I pressed my face to the glass and tried to see into the dark, but there was nothing out there. Just blackness and some stars above the treetops. I convinced myself it was probably a deer or some other animal passing by. I got back into the sleeping bag, kept the fire low, and didn't fall asleep again until the sky started turning gray. The next day, I tried not to let it get to me. I drank some coffee from the old metal percolator and chopped more wood. Around noon, I went back down the trail behind the cabin, but this time I followed a different fork that went past the ravine and climbed a ridge on the far side. At the top, I found a clearing with a view of the valley below. It was beautiful, quiet. I stayed up there for a while, just watching the clouds and listening to the wind. On the way back, I passed the ravine again. Something caught my eye on the far side. Across the ravine, maybe 20 yards from the trail, was a boot. Just one boot, old and weathered, brown leather, half buried in leaves. It was turned on its side like someone had tossed it. There were no other footprints around it that I could see, and no path leading toward it. I didn't cross the ravine to check, it was too steep, but I stood there staring at it for a long time. I had a weird feeling in my chest. Something felt off. That night, I locked the cabin door. It had one of those old slide bolts and a wooden bar you could drop into a slot. I made sure it was secure. I didn't hear anything unusual that night, but I didn't sleep well either. The fourth day started off fine. I stayed close to the cabin. I cleaned up, read more, and wrote in the notebook. But by afternoon, I felt restless again. I walked back to the ravine and checked if the boot was still there. It was. This time I marked the location on a scrap of paper and drew a rough map so I could mention it to someone later. Still, I told myself it could have just been left behind by a hiker years ago. Maybe it had washed down during a storm or something. That night, something happened that I still think about almost every day. It was after midnight. I was asleep but woke up again, just like before. Like my body knew something was wrong. I stayed in the sleeping bag for a while, not moving, listening. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then, slowly, I started hearing what sounded like something brushing against the cabin wall. Not scratching, just a soft, steady drag, like someone running a stick along the boards. Then it stopped. Then it started again on the other side. I didn't have a weapon, just a hatchet I kept by the stove for splitting kindling. I reached over slowly and grabbed it. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what I was going to do with it if someone came in. I didn't want to find out. I crouched low and crept to the window. I looked out again and saw nothing, but I could still hear the noise. Then I realized something that made my heart start pounding harder. The sound wasn't random. It was circling the cabin, slow and steady, like someone was walking the perimeter, dragging something along the outside wall. A full circle, and then it stopped. I didn't move. I just stayed by the window, holding the hatchet, staring out. Minutes passed. Then something hit the window. Not hard, just a tap, like a finger or a small stone. One, then two, then nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the stove with the hatchet in my hand until the sky started to lighten. When the sun came up, I went outside. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone, but I noticed something near the base of the porch. A stick, long and thin, freshly snapped from a tree. It was lying in the dirt, perfectly straight, like it had been used for something. That was the day I decided to leave early. I packed up everything and loaded the car. But when I went to start it, nothing happened. The engine didn't even turn over, just a single clicking sound. Battery was dead. I hadn't left any lights on. I hadn't used anything that would drain it. It had been fine for days. But now, nothing. I didn't panic. Not at first. I figured I could walk to the main road. It would take a few hours, but I could make it before dark. I had a pack, water, food, and a flashlight. But when I started walking, I noticed something that stopped me cold. On the trail just past the clearing where the path met the start of the ridge, there were tracks. Not animal tracks. Bootprints. Fresh ones. Deep enough to be recent, pointed straight toward the cabin. And then, a few feet later, they just stopped. No turn. No retreat. Just ended. I backed up slowly and returned to the cabin. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to stay another night, but I wasn't about to hike into the woods not knowing who or what was out there. I stayed inside all day. I kept the fire low. I blocked the windows with anything I could find. I set up a noise trap with empty cans on a string across the front porch. I didn't care if it was paranoid. I didn't sleep at all that night. Around 3 a.m., I heard the cans rattle. Just once. Then silence. I sat there, gripping the hatchet, for 3 more hours. When the sky started turning pink, I packed the essentials and left on foot. I walked fast, not stopping once. I didn't look back. It took me 4 hours to reach the main road. I flagged down a trucker heading south and asked for a ride to the nearest gas station. I didn't tell him much, just that my car died and I needed a tow. When we got back to the cabin with the tow guy, my car started on the first try. I didn't go back inside. I didn't tell the tow driver about the stick or the sounds or the boot or the circles around the cabin. I drove home and didn't talk about it with anyone for a long time. I had nightmares for weeks. Every little sound made me jump. I still don't know who or what was out there. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters. I think it was a person. Maybe someone who lived off-grid nearby. Maybe someone watching the area. Maybe just someone passing through who saw the cabin and decided to mess with me. I'll never know, but I've never felt that kind of fear again. That deep, primal fear that someone is just outside your walls, watching, waiting. I've never been back to the cabin. I don't plan to. I stay in hotels now. I was 32 when it happened. It was fall, mid-October, and I just quit my job at a logistics warehouse in Albany. I didn't leave on bad terms, but I felt burned out. The stress had piled up over the last couple years. Long shifts, no appreciation, back pain from lifting pallets all day. So when I finally quit, I felt free but directionless. I needed some time to clear my head, and that's when my cousin Luke reached out. Luke lived in upstate New York, about 3 hours from me, in a rural area called Seneca Valley. He owned a 100-acre property with cattle, a few horses, chickens, and a small produce field. He wasn't a full-time farmer, more like a hobbyist who worked odd jobs. But he lived off the land more than most people I knew. On one side of the property was his main house, and about a half-mile down a gravel road, there was an old cabin he used for storage, sometimes for guests. He said I could stay there for a while if I wanted.
No rent.
Just help out with a few chores now and then. It sounded perfect. Fresh air, peace and quiet, no pressure. I could sleep, read, maybe figure out what I wanted to do next. So I packed some clothes, my boots, a folding chair, and a couple books, then drove out early on a Monday. It was cool that morning, mid-40s, dry and crisp. Leaves were just starting to change, so the hills around the valley looked like rust and gold. Luke met me by the main house and helped me unload. He gave me a quick rundown of the cabin. No Wi-Fi, no running water, but it had power from a solar rig on the property. He'd stocked the little fridge with some basics: milk, eggs, lunch meat. There was a cast iron with stove for heat, and a stack of split logs just outside the door. It was about as quiet as a place could be. The first 2 days were everything I hoped for. I'd wake up just after sunrise, drink coffee on the small front porch, and listen to the woods settle into daylight. Birds, squirrels, the occasional cow in the distance. I helped Luke feed the animals, hauled a few hay bales, then went back to the cabin, made lunch, napped, and read. At night, I'd light the stove and eat simple meals. Just quiet, easy living. But by the third day, I started noticing things. The first thing was the gate. The gravel road that led from the cabin to the main house had a small livestock gate where the fence line ran across it. It wasn't locked, just a chain looped over a post. I'd gone up around noon to help Luke clear out a shed, and when I came back down to the cabin, the gate was wide open. Not just unlatched, fully swung out, resting against the grass. I figured maybe I'd forgotten to close it, even though I was almost sure I had. Still, not a big deal. I closed it and went inside. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing something outside, not constant, but small sounds. Branches snapping, a thump like something hitting the wall. I thought maybe it was a deer or raccoon. Maybe even a bear passing through, though they weren't that common this time of year. I sat up once around 2 a.m. and looked out the window, but didn't see anything. The woods were pitch black, no moon. I tried to ignore it, lay back down, and eventually drifted off. The next morning, I found something strange. There were boot prints near the cabin. Not mine. These ones were heavier, wider. The tread pattern didn't match my boots. They came from the woods behind the cabin, an area that sloped down into a narrow creek and led straight up to the side wall. They stopped just a few feet from the back window. Then they turned around and went back into the trees. No animal makes prints like that. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. There wasn't much to go on. No trash, no sign of damage. Just those prints. I told myself maybe Luke had come by early and walked around, but it didn't sit right. I didn't hear a truck, and he wouldn't have come from the woods. Still, I didn't want to overthink it. I spent the rest of the day closer to the main house, helping Luke fix a fence. That night, I locked the cabin door. There was a simple deadbolt, and wedged a small piece of wood against the doorknob, just to be safe. I also pulled the curtains shut on all the windows. When it got dark, I kept the lights low, just a lamp and the stove. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I wasn't scared exactly, but I felt watched. It was the kind of tension that sits between your shoulder blades and doesn't leave. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of gravel crunching. Slow, steady steps. I stayed perfectly still. The sound moved from the front of the cabin around toward the side. Then silence. A long silence. I didn't dare get up to look. My heart was pounding. I just lay there under the blanket, staring at the ceiling, listening. Then another sound, metal. It was the door handle. Just a small rattle, like someone trying it very gently. I froze. No banging, no force. Just a faint test, like they were checking to see if it was open. Then, after about 10 seconds, nothing. Silence again. I don't know how long I lay there after that. Maybe an hour. I didn't hear the gravel again. Eventually, I slipped into a light sleep, barely real rest. In the morning, I checked the area. No new prints that I could see. Maybe the gravel didn't take them well, but there were 2 deep smudges near the porch steps, like someone had crouched there. Again, no sign of damage. Nothing taken, just presence. I walked to the main house and told Luke about it in passing. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I just mentioned seeing prints, hearing things. He shrugged and said there were hunters in the area sometimes, but most stayed on public land. He hadn't seen anyone unusual. Still, I could tell he was a little uneasy too. He offered to let me stay at the main house, but I declined. I didn't want to seem spooked. I should have taken him up on it. That afternoon, I didn't go back to the cabin. I stuck around the barn, worked on cleaning some tack, helped muck out a stall. I only returned to the cabin right before sunset. The sky was purple and gold, long shadows stretching across the field. I kept checking behind me as I walked. Every sound felt sharper. Every rustle in the grass made me tense. Inside, I kept all the lights off. I lit one candle and moved it into the bathroom when I brushed my teeth. I didn't even open the fridge. I just ate a granola bar and drank tap water from the jug. I sat in the middle of the floor with my back against the wall, facing the door, just waiting. I had my pocket knife in one hand. I didn't plan to use it. I just felt better holding it. At some point past midnight, I heard movement again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was something scraping along the side of the cabin, like a stick or metal dragging across the wall. A slow, steady scratch. It circled the whole building. I felt my throat tighten. I held my breath for so long I started to feel dizzy. Then it stopped. Total silence for maybe 2 minutes. Then one sound, a single knock on the door. Just one. Not hard, not loud, but deliberate. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, frozen. I waited for another knock, but none came. After a few minutes, I crawled across the floor, got behind the couch, and stayed there until the sun came up. When daylight came, I packed everything in 10 minutes. I didn't shower. I didn't eat. I shoved clothes into my duffel, unplugged my phone charger, and didn't even fold the sleeping bag. I just crammed it all in and walked fast up the gravel road to the main house. Luke wasn't there. He'd gone into town to pick up feed. I left him a note thanking him and drove off without saying goodbye. I never went back. A month later, I called Luke just to check in, and he told me someone had broken into one of his storage sheds down near the field line. They didn't take anything, but they'd pried the lock off and left the door open. He said he'd found cigarette butts in the grass near the tree line. That was it. I haven't stayed in the woods since. I still don't know who it was. I don't know if they were just messing with me or planning something worse, but I know someone was there, watching, testing the edges, getting closer each night, not trying to scare me off, but maybe trying to see what I'd do. And I didn't do anything.